Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we can begin our webinar. So I should begin by introducing myself. I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this morning's event. So our formal purpose today is to launch a new study, Civic and Political Engagement among Young People in Ireland. Obviously, this is work conducted by the ESRI, but done in collaboration with our colleagues in the Department of Children and in the Department of Rural and Community Development. So we have a pretty busy morning, so I'm not going to take up too much time. In a moment, delighted to say Minister Joe O'Brien will join us to formally launch the report and to say a few words on the topic. That will be followed then by the presentation of the report by my colleagues James Laurence from the ESRI. We'll have three policy responses, and I'll introduce the various speakers as we move along, and then hopefully, if everybody's reasonably disciplined and stays to time, we'll be able to have a little bit of Q&A towards the end with the authors and the policy respondents. So during the course of the event, if you can be thinking of your questions and submit them through the chat function, then I'll try and relay them onwards to the colleagues. So with that said, really eager not to take up too much time. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Minister Joe O'Brien. Minister O'Brien, again, Minister state in a number of departments, which we won't go through them right now, but we were saying a few moments ago, Minister O'Brien actually has really engaged very positively with ESRI work since he took over his role. We've been obviously very, very grateful for that. There's always a desire in the Institute to bring the work that we do sort of, into the heart of government and to make sure that the mission is actually realized, which is providing evidence for policy. So we do the work, but obviously it's over to people like Minister O'Brien to make sure that implementation at some level happens. So we're always really, really delighted that he engages with us to the extent that he has done. So with that, Minister O'Brien, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Alan, and good morning, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be able to launch this report today on civic and political engagement among young adults in rural Ireland. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to James Laurence and Emer Smith of the ESRI for all their hard work compiling this really excellent research and writing the report, and also to those in the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, and the Department of Rural and Community Development who were involved in commissioning the report. So this research builds upon the data collected by the Growing Up in Ireland longitudinal study of children, which has been tracking children's lives since 2006, and really demonstrates how this vital longitudinal data bank is helping us to understand the development and well-being of young people in Ireland. I suppose what first struck me when reading the report is how many young people in rural Ireland are actually engaged in volunteering. And Ireland's greatest asset is its people, and the people in rural Ireland are passionate about bringing positive changes to their communities. And I think this report shows that rural youth share their parents' generation's commitment to volunteering as well. I was very impressed by the fact that there are 36% of rural young adults volunteering by the time they reach the age of 20. The report also highlights that volunteering also benefits the volunteers themselves. Young people who volunteer have higher life satisfaction, and volunteering also helps their self-confidence. And I think it's really important that we don't take the valuable work of volunteers in rural Ireland for granted. And it's only right that government encourages and celebrates our young volunteers and provides funding to volunteer infrastructure. And I think not just through the thousands of the community and voluntary organisations nationally, but via our established and funded volunteer centres, which are now in every local authority area as well. Of course, there are challenges to rural youth becoming involved in volunteering, especially around access to public transport and broadband. And government recognises that frequent and affordable public transport is key to participation and inclusion in rural communities. Access to reliable public transport services is particularly important for young people in rural areas whose independence is restricted if they have to rely on family or friends for transport. But through Connecting Ireland, this government is increasing transport connectivity for people living in rural Ireland, and we are adding a new local link service every week this year, for example. Overall, 100 rural villages will for the first time benefit from frequent and reliable public transport. Also, public transport has been made more affordable. The Young Adult Card provides young people aged between 19 and 25 with an average 50% discount on previous fares. Specifically in relation to broadband access in rural areas as well, the National Broadband Plan is delivering access to high-speed broadband in every premises in Ireland, regardless of location, including the offshore islands as well. And the continuing implementation of the plan has the potential to further transform rural Ireland. It will help to sustain and increase the population of rural areas, revitalise town centres, reduce commute times, lower transport emissions, and give young people in rural Ireland more career opportunities as well. The report also identifies that rural youth are more likely to be engaged in sports volunteering at the age of 20 compared to urban youth. Higher rates of sports volunteering show the great importance of sport in rural life. As well as being important from the perspective of well-being, sport can be a powerful tool for building communities and tackling social exclusion. Government is determined to hear the political voice of rural young people, and as part of our government's Our Rural Future plan, we established the National Rural Youth Assembly to provide a platform for young people in rural Ireland to have their say on topics of importance to them and to produce recommendations for the government to consider in the future. That's why it was my pleasure to attend and meet the brilliant delegates of the third sitting of Ireland's National Youth Rural Assembly in Dublin Castle last month. And the Assembly gathered around 65 delegates aged between 12 and 25 at Dublin Castle to discuss the challenges and opportunities for young people participating in civic society in rural Ireland. And people travelled from all across the country, from Donegal, from Kerry and the islands, to discuss the opportunities and challenges and benefits of civic participation in rural Ireland, and to make recommendations for consideration by policymakers across government. And it was really great to see, I think, at the forum in operation and the dynamism as well of the young people in attendance. And I did a bit of a straw poll myself on the day as well among the people that I spoke to, the young people that I spoke to, and the public transport one came out again and repeatedly in my conversations. Government wants to continue to involve young people in decision making to plan for a future, their future, that allows them to remain in or indeed return to their local communities to live, study, socialise and work. And its Department of Children Equality, Disability Integration and Youth and its Department of Rural and Community Development will continue to fund and promote Comhairle na nÓg, a permanent structure representing young voices in decision making in Ireland. And this will ensure that young people's views are given due weight in decision making at local and national level. Comhairle members have contributed to national policy, including the development of the LGBTI+ National Youth Strategy, the review of the relationships and sexuality education in primary and post-primary schools for the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, a new strategy for the Environmental Protection Agency, assessing the impact of COVID-19 on young people's well-being, teacher supply and physical activity, the Climate Action Plan, crucially as well, and many more issues. And all of this, I suppose, shows the growing importance of young people's voices in policy making. This report has really broadened our knowledge and our understanding of civic and political engagement among young adults in rural Ireland, and it clearly identifies the key concerns of young people in rural areas and how the government can better facilitate their civic and political engagement into the future. The policy implications have relevance to a number of government departments, beyond the two of which were involved in the commissioning of this report. For example, the findings in relation to the link between civic engagement and participation in transition year will be of real interest to colleagues in the Department of Education. Likewise, the findings in relation to the link between participation in cultural after-school activities at a young age and civic engagement later in life will be of interest to colleagues in the Department of Tourism, Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. The report also illuminates how many young people in rural Ireland are making a positive contribution in their communities. The government wants these young people to know that their contribution is very much appreciated and valued, and that volunteering is celebrated for its vital contribution to Irish society. And we will continue to work with young people to develop rural communities as vibrant, inclusive and sustainable places where people want to live. Once again, I'd like to give my thanks to the authors James Laurence and Emer Smith, and thanks to everyone in the two departments who were involved in commissioning this report. In particular, though, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the young participants of Growing Up in Ireland who give so generously of their time and answer the survey questions, which mean we have an excellent bank of information and data about young people's civic engagement. Pleasure to be involved in this report in a small way. Well done to everyone. And I'll hear a little bit of the proceedings to follow, but unfortunately I won't be able to stay for the whole event this morning. So I'll pass it back to you, Alan. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Minister. Appreciated the remarks. And actually, just a quick remark of my own. I was attending an event, sharing an event with your party leader there a few weeks ago, the National Climate Stakeholders Forum. And again, if ever there was a reminder that if we're going to have success on the climate and green issues generally, community engagement is absolutely critical. So for me, it was just a reminder in advance of me reading this report, just how critical this area actually is. So I know that that's an issue that will be close to your heart as well. So listen, thanks once again. Now we need to move on to the meat and veg of the morning's event. So I'm going to call on my colleague James Laurence, who will take us through the details of the report. So James, can I ask you to come forward?
Great, thanks, Alan. I'll just share my screen now. So the report was funded by the Department of Children, Department of Rural and Community Development through a joint research partnership with the ESRI. So we'd just like to acknowledge the department's commitment to the funding. So before we begin, it's really important just to kind of understand what we mean when we're talking about civic and political engagement. So broadly speaking, civic and political engagement are really about how people get involved in the world around them and try and change it. So civic engagement involves young people volunteering their time to help others through organizations. And this might be things like coaching sports teams or fundraising, working with charities or social organizations. Political engagement, meanwhile, this involves young people undertaking activities in which they express opinions on the world and how it is governed, and really try to shape the decisions that affect their lives. And this can include a whole range of things, such as signing a petition, all the way up to taking part in demonstrations, working with political or environmental groups, and even voting as well. So prior research has really shown that civic and political engagement can have a lot of benefits. So volunteering clearly has benefits for communities and the societies in which they're embedded. This can involve things like providing help and support for people and filling important gaps in resources, and also just contributing to community development in general. In fact, recent estimates have put the value of volunteering to the Irish economy at over €5 billion per year. But interestingly, research has also shown that volunteering can also benefit those who volunteer themselves. This can involve things like improved physical health, improved mental well-being. It's also linked to expanded social networks. This can lead to job opportunities. And also it kind of grows the skills of the volunteers and people who are involved. Political engagement, meanwhile, is really just kind of critical for a healthy democracy. It's kind of at the heart of every functioning democracy, as it's about the active involvement of citizens that are engaged in the formulation, the passage, and the implementation of public policies. And it can really help ensure a diversity of people's voices are heard in politics, and also that people's views are on the political agenda as well. So when it comes to young people, civic and political engagement are seen as key to young people's connection to their societies and their communities. In the government's national policy framework for children and young people, they identify engagement as a critical part of the vision for young people to feel connected, respected, and contributing to their world. Interestingly, fostering engagement has also, as the Minister alluded to, kind of been identified as a key means of empowering young people in rural areas in particular. So this may help the future sustainability of rural communities. Opportunities to make a meaningful contribution to their local community are really thought to be potentially decisive in determining whether young people continue to live in or even return to rural areas. The thing is, rural youth may also face different obstacles to engagement than urban youth, and understanding these differences is really important to enable equal opportunities for all young people to participate. The Our Rural Future report, for example, highlighted how young people in rural areas feel there is a lack of facilities for them or access to public transport. And these kinds of things may have knock-on effects on their opportunities to engage. So given these potential benefits of civic and political participation, a key issue is that there is currently little systematic research in Ireland on the patterns and drivers of civic and political engagement, especially amongst young people. Similarly, we also find that there is little evidence on whether patterns of engagement differ between urban and rural young people, and whether groups experience different drivers of or obstacles to engagement as well. So it's really therefore crucial to have this evidence base to identify the drivers of civic and political engagement in order to better support young people's involvement. So what this study does, it really tries to fill this important gap by looking at these three key questions. So do civic and political engagement vary between rural and urban areas? What factors in young people's lives are related to civic and political engagement? And do the factors associated with their engagement differ between rural and urban settings? Also, how is civic and political engagement related to young adults' life outcomes, including their well-being, such as life satisfaction or depression, and also the extent to which they consider themselves an adult and their sense of trust in others as well. So to pursue these aims, this project uses data on young people from the Growing Up in Ireland 1998 cohort. So this was, I'm sure many of you know, a representative sample of young children, born in Ireland in 1997 to 1998. And at the time, at its inception, 1 in every 7 of the 9-year-olds resident in the country were present in the survey. So it's really an incredible resource. So we use in the study 4 waves of data from the GUI. This follows young people from 9 years old all the way up to 20 years old, which was done in 2019. And the nice thing about this data set is that it contains detailed information on a huge range of aspects of young people's lives, including their family background, their social lives, schooling and education, the neighborhoods they live in and they grew up in. And this covers a period from childhood to early adulthood. Now, this is a really key advantage to this data because research has shown that young people's experiences in childhood and adolescence can really have these long-lasting impacts on the civic and political trajectories they go into in adulthood. And this data allows us to kind of explore this. So turning to how engagement is measured in the data, civic engagement is captured by looking at young people's involvement in volunteering at both age 17 and 20. Now, this is specifically volunteer activities undertaken for or through an organization. In the analysis, we actually distinguish between those involved in sports-related volunteering activities and also those related involved in all other non-sports related volunteering. This is because a significant number of young people are involved in sports volunteering, and also their profile may differ from that of other volunteers. So to capture the multidimensional nature of political engagement, we use 3 different indicators. We look at the number of political activities a young person has undertaken, and this can include like low intensity activities, don't really take a significant commitment to perform, such as signing a petition or boycotting goods, all the way up to more high intensity activities, such as working for a political party or group or attending a demonstration. Alongside this, we also look at whether young people are registered to vote and also how interested they say they are in politics as well. So when it comes to looking at whether there are differences between urban and rural youth, young people are categorized as having grown up in an urban or rural area based on their mother's reports of where they were living at age 9. So young people who were in areas of less than 5,000 people were categorized as rural youth for this study, and those settlements of greater than 5,000 people were categorized as urban youth. And we did some more detailed analysis of where we kind of dug down a bit more to see whether there were differences across the full range of different types of settlement. And this distinction mapped very closely onto the civic participation division that we'll be exploring later. But it's just important to kind of keep in mind, therefore, that what we're looking at in this study is differences in engagement at age 20 among young people who grew up in urban and rural areas. So it's not necessarily where they're living now. And we can talk about that a bit later. So what are the factors in people's lives that might drive their levels of engagement? So drawing on the current research in the area, this slide essentially just summarizes the range of domains that we explore that could be associated with their engagement later in life. And this ranges from family background to social networks, their local areas, their educational experiences, their involvement in extracurricular activities, and also their current situation in adulthood as well, such as where they live or whether they're experiencing financial strain. And again, as discussed, prior research has really shown that experiences across people's early life course can play a big part of their engagement in adulthood. So the really neat thing about this is we can explore these kinds of domains in people's lives, both in childhood and early adolescence, but also into later adolescence and young adulthood as well. Okay, so we start by looking at whether there are any different patterns in civic and political engagement between urban and rural areas. So what this figure shows is the proportion of young people from urban and rural areas who volunteer. It shows us how young people who grew up in urban and rural areas actually have somewhat different patterns of volunteering, as the minister said. So we find that rural youth, that's the blue bar, they're more involved in volunteering at age 17 compared to urban youth, and that's the red bar. At age 20, we again see that rural youth are also more likely to be volunteering than urban youth as well. However, if we actually dig a bit deeper into this, we find that the higher level of volunteering among rural youth is really being driven by their higher level of volunteering for sports-related organizations. So when it comes to volunteering for other non-sports related organizations, we actually see no difference in engagement between urban and rural youth. So turning to political engagement, this slide shows the proportion of urban and rural youth involved in different forms of political engagement at age 20. So first of all, we see that compared to volunteering, young people who grew up in urban areas are actually significantly more likely to be involved in political activities than rural youth. And this includes both low-intensity political activities, such as signing a petition or contacting a politician, as well as those high-intensity political activities we spoke about, such as joining a political group or taking part in a demonstration. At the same time, there is no significant difference in young people's level of interest in politics, which tends to be equally low for both urban and rural youth. There is also no significant difference in the proportion of urban and rural youth who are registered to vote, with a similarly high proportion of both groups being registered. Okay, so we next turn to examining the drivers of young people's civic and political engagement. And this involves looking at all those factors we've been talking about and how they might play a part in young people's engagement behaviors in early adulthood. So in the following slides, we'll just kind of highlight some of the most important factors to emerge from the analysis. So we start by looking at the drivers of volunteering over young people's lives. Firstly, we do find a strong social gradient in volunteering across young people's family background. In particular, young people whose mothers had higher levels of education tend to undertake more volunteering of all kinds in adulthood. There is also evidence that young people who grew up in private or social rental tenancies tend to undertake less volunteering in adulthood as well. We do find some differences in volunteering across gender. So young women are somewhat more involved in non-sports volunteering than young men. Young men, however, are more involved in sports volunteering than young women, as in organized sports more generally. In fact, we do find that young women who grew up in urban areas in particular are much less likely to be involved in sports volunteering than their rural peers. As might be expected as well, young people who grew up with poorer health or a disability are somewhat less likely to be involved in sports volunteering, but importantly, they're just as likely to be involved in non-sports volunteering as well. So social networks are also coming out as very important in this. So having a larger social networks during adolescence and also more gender and ethnic diversity in one's friendship group is linked to more volunteering in adulthood. Similarly, young people who grew up knowing and meeting their friends' parents, who grew up really in those kinds of more tight-knit communities, are also more likely to undertake sports volunteering in adulthood. We also find that young people who went to church more frequently in their youth are more involved in both sports and non-sports volunteering in adulthood. So the local areas that young people grew up in and are actually still living in adulthood are also very important for engagement behaviors. So we find that having access to youth facilities such as youth clubs and sports clubs, and also having access to public transport, are both linked to more volunteering for sports organizations. In urban areas, we actually find that having access to youth facilities and public transport are also more linked to more non-sports volunteering as well as sports volunteering. So these are particularly important for these groups. And lastly, we also find that young people who grew up in safer neighborhoods are found to be more involved in sports volunteering in adulthood as well. So one of the most important factors in young people's lives for their volunteering that came out of the analysis is their experiences in education. Young people who took a transition year and were on a higher education track tend to volunteer more in adulthood for all kinds of organizations. Young people who enjoyed school when they were younger, got on well there, and attended schools that placed a higher importance on sports and arts-related extracurricular activities are also found to do more non-sports volunteering in adulthood. Young people who scored higher in their LSAT exams are also more likely to volunteer. And interestingly, this relationship between exam performance and volunteering is particularly strong in urban areas. So we see that young people who grew up in an urban area but scored lower on their LSAT exams tend to have particularly low levels of volunteering in adulthood compared to their peers in rural areas. So we next turn to looking at the potential drivers of political engagement among young adults. So as with volunteering, we again find this similar strong social gradient in political engagement across young people's family backgrounds, with those who grew up with mothers who had higher levels of education are again more likely to be involved in all forms of political engagement at age 20. In addition, young people who grew up in homes with a higher household income are also more likely to be registered to vote and to express more interest in politics in adulthood as well. However, what's interesting is that we also find some markers of socioeconomic disadvantage appear to be linked to more political engagement. So we find that experiencing greater neighborhood disorder, an absence of local youth facilities, feeling accommodation costs can limit life opportunities, having trouble repaying loans, and also a disability status are all positively linked to political activities and an interest in politics at age 20 for some young people. So this may reflect some kind of politicizing effect of experiencing hardships and also maybe a keener understanding of certain problems in society. So as with volunteering, we also see, as with political engagement, some differences between genders. At age 20, young women are more involved in political activities than young men. They are also more likely to be registered to vote than young men, although we do find that young women tend to report somewhat less political interest than men. So interestingly, this finding could potentially reflect the fact that when young people were studied and surveyed in 2019, this was shortly after the campaign to repeal the constitutional ban on abortion. And young women, as we know, were particularly active in this campaign, and this may be reflected in their higher political engagement at age 20. So as with volunteering, we again see that having a larger social network and more friends from other genders and ethnicities, so more diversity in one's network, is linked with higher political engagement. And this is particularly strong in urban areas. However, for religious attendance, we actually find somewhat different results. While young people who attended church more frequently in their youth volunteer more at age 20, they're generally less politically engaged at age 20. Young people's education experiences again come out as a key domain for their political engagement in adulthood. Young people who felt that they enjoyed school and got along well there, attended a school that placed a higher importance on extracurricular activities, those who took a transition year, who scored more points on their junior and leaving certificate exams, and who are on a higher or further education track are all more politically engaged in adulthood. So one factor that appears to play a particularly strong role in young people's engagement in adulthood is their involvement in extracurricular activities when they were growing up. And those young people who were more involved in extracurricular activities in childhood and adolescence tend to volunteer more and also undertake more political activities in adulthood. And importantly, this is after we account for all the other factors that we've been looking at, such as family background or education. These kinds of activities are still important after that. At the same time, though, we also see that the types of extracurricular activities that young people were involved in are linked with different forms of engagement in adulthood. So we see that those involved in non-sports related activities, this could be cultural groups like drama or music, or in organized groups such as Scouts and Guides, they tend to do more non-sports volunteering in adulthood. They're also more involved in political activities as well when they grow up. Meanwhile, those who are involved in sports-related extracurricular activities, they tend to grow up to go on and do more sports volunteering in adulthood. However, we also see that this group also undertake fewer political activities. And this is particularly true of young people in rural areas who are involved in sports extracurricular activities. We also find that extracurricular activities can explain part of why other factors in young people's lives are linked to their engagement in adulthood. So, for example, we find that part of the reason non-sports volunteering is higher amongst young people with mothers who had a higher education, or among people who attended church more frequently, is actually because these groups tended to be more involved in extracurricular activities in their youth. Okay, so we return now to the different patterns of engagement that we initially saw among urban and rural youth. We find that part of the reason rural youth undertake higher sports volunteering in adulthood can actually be explained by other differences between urban and rural young people, such as in their family background or the types of areas they grew up in. But what's important is that even after we account for these differences, a significant gap in sports volunteering remains between urban and rural youth. So this suggests potentially that some feature of growing up in a rural area continues to foster more volunteering for sports organizations in adulthood. And one possibility might be involvement in the Gaelic Athletic Association amongst rural youth. I mean, this might have some lasting effect on young people from rural areas. Turning to political engagement, we also find that part of the reason why rural youth undertake fewer political activities in adulthood can again be explained by these other differences in the social worlds of urban and rural young people. However, once more, even after we account for these differences, a significant gap remains, suggesting some feature of growing up in rural areas may continue to depress political engagement into adulthood. So one explanation is that rural youth may feel further removed from politics and the political center of urban areas than urban youth do. And this may affect their sense of being listened to or to lead to a greater sense of powerlessness. I mean, in fact, we do actually find that rural youth feel less like they can influence politics. For example, they are more likely than urban youth to say, it doesn't really matter which political party is in power. In the end, things go on much the same. And also say the ordinary person has no influence on politics. So we see these kinds of differences in perceived political efficacy between urban and rural areas. Okay, so far we've looked at what factors may drive young people's civic and political engagement. And in this final section, what we do is we explore how engagement is related to young people's life outcomes. So one way engagement could benefit young adults is by directly affecting the outcomes of those who take part. When it comes to volunteering, we see that young people who were volunteering at age 20 reported higher life satisfaction and also more confidence in themselves as adults at age 20. For example, they were more likely to feel like an adult or feel they became an adult faster than their peers. And importantly, this is after controlling in the models for all the other characteristics of young people when they were age 20, as well as controlling for the measure of their life outcome at age 17 as well. However, another way that volunteering may help young people is by potentially acting as a source of protection from the potential negative effects of living in communities with a weaker social infrastructure. So a neighborhood's social infrastructure is the extent to which an area has things like leisure and sports facilities for young people, places where young people can meet, and also how far young people have friends in the area as well. And so these aspects of a community can be important for strengthening young people's social networks, which research shows can really improve their life outcomes. In fact, we do find in our study that young people in areas with a weaker social infrastructure tend to report lower life satisfaction, more depressive symptoms, less trust in people, and also they're less likely to feel confident as an adult. So potentially, volunteering could protect young people from these negative effects. And this is indeed what we actually find. We focus for the moment just on young people's mental well-being. So what this figure shows is that young people's level of life satisfaction on the vertical axis. So here, higher values equate to greater satisfaction. The figure also shows how life satisfaction varies depending on the strength of the social infrastructure in a young person's neighborhood, and that's along the horizontal axis. So here, higher scores equate to a stronger social infrastructure. The red line on the figure shows this relationship for young people who volunteer, and the blue line shows this relationship for young people who don't volunteer. So what the figure shows is that in areas with a strong social infrastructure, young people's life satisfaction is comparatively high, regardless of whether they're volunteering or not. When we look at areas with a weak social infrastructure, that's the lower scores, the life satisfaction of young people who don't volunteer, again, that's the blue line, is much lower. However, the life satisfaction of young people who do volunteer is just as high as if they were in neighborhoods with a strong social infrastructure. In other words, that gap seems to suggest that people who volunteer don't experience the negative effect of living in areas with a weaker social infrastructure. And essentially, volunteering may be therefore acting as a source of protection. We actually see a similar relationship when it comes to young people's level of depression. Again, this figure shows young people's depression score on the vertical axis, where higher values equate to more depression. It also shows how depression scores vary on based on the strength of the social infrastructure in young people's local areas, and that's along the horizontal axis. So once more, we see that among those who volunteer, that's the red line, their depression scores are similarly low regardless of the strength of the local social infrastructure. However, among young people who do not volunteer, as the social infrastructure in their local areas weakens, their depression scores increase. Again, this suggests that volunteering may be able to act as a kind of source of protection for young people's mental health against the potential negative effects of weaker social infrastructure. When it comes to young people's political engagement, a more complex picture emerges. So we see that young people who are more interested in politics tend to feel they became an adult quicker than their peers, and also to report more trust in people. When it comes to political activities, those who undertake more felt they grew up quicker as well. However, they also tend to have higher depression scores too. So digging deeper into this, we find that this negative association between political activities and mental health is only really linked to undertaking those more low-intensity, individualized forms of political engagement, such as signing a petition or boycotting products. So it may be that when that political engagement that does not involve working with other people, such as those high-intensity forms of engagement, this may kind of consolidate feelings of helplessness, perhaps, with problems in society, perhaps reinforcing worse mental health. Okay, so to summarize then the key points of our study, we observe significant gaps in engagement between urban and rural areas, and these cannot be entirely explained by different characteristics and social worlds of urban and rural youth. And there appears to be some feature of these types of areas which have these different impacts on young people. We also find a strong social gradient in participation. In particular, young people from more educated mothers are much more likely to undertake all forms of engagement in adulthood. Our analysis reveals that education really is a key domain in shaping young people's engagement in adulthood. So we find that school enjoyment and engagement in school, the culture of extracurricular activities in a school, taking a transition year, academic achievement, and being on a higher and further education track are all really important for all forms of engagement in adulthood. We also see that the neighborhoods young people grow up in and live, they also appear very important for their engagement. In particular, access to local youth facilities and public transport. Of particular importance really is this idea of social infrastructure of young people's neighborhoods, such as whether they have places to meet other people or leisure and sports facilities. We find that this is important both for their patterns of engagement, but also for their life outcomes as well. A key factor for engagement is also involvement in extracurricular activities in youth. And as we saw, this is strongly linked to young people's engagement in adulthood. In addition, we also saw that different involvement in different kinds of activities in youth can help explain other inequalities in engagement in adulthood. However, the types of activities young people are involved in youth also appear to channel young people into different forms of engagement in adulthood, such as sports volunteering, non-sports volunteering, and political engagement. Lastly, we observed that volunteering is linked with positive life outcomes, and that it may also protect young people who live in neighborhoods with weaker social infrastructure as well. Political engagement, meanwhile, has a somewhat more complicated relationship with young people's life outcomes. So finally, in terms of the implications of the study for policy, there are several potentially more malleable domains that could be shaped to boost engagement among young people that our report identifies. So as discussed, young people's experiences in education tend to play a key role in their later life participation. So here, bolstering things like the role of civic, social and political engagement at senior cycle could really help foster more engagement in adulthood. This might be particularly important for young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Encouraging further take-up of the transition year would also likely benefit engagement, especially among disadvantaged youth who are currently somewhat less likely to take up the option. Broader efforts to promote school engagement and achievement in general could really have a positive spillover effect on young adults' engagement when they grow up. Encouraging greater involvement in extracurricular activities during childhood and adolescence could really foster greater engagement in adulthood. However, given activities often require payment and resources, then subsidies for disadvantaged families and additional resources for smaller schools could help widen opportunities to undertake a range of extracurricular activities for young people. The findings also suggest that improving the provision of local youth facilities, such as youth clubs and sports and leisure facilities, as well as regular affordable public transport, could really help foster opportunities to be involved in communities when people are younger, which has these long-term impacts on their engagement later in life. In doing so, this may also help strengthen the social infrastructure of neighborhoods, and strengthening the social infrastructure would really have significant benefits both for life outcomes, but also young people's engagement as well. And in light of this, involving young people in community development initiatives could really significantly help. But I think ultimately the kind of report shows that civic and political engagement benefits both society and the individuals involved. And we also find that closing the gaps in civic and political engagement between different groups of young people, such as those from more or less disadvantaged neighborhoods, would therefore reap dividends really, both for young people and society as a whole. And that's where I'll end. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, James. I knew it was a fascinating report, but you really brought all the different components together brilliantly there. So thanks for that. Now, as I mentioned at the outset of the event, we have three essentially respondents to the paper. So the first respondent is Sinead Quinn, who's from the Department of Rural and Community Development, one of the commissioning departments. So Sinead, do you want to turn on the camera and the microphone, and we'll hear your reflections. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. My name is Sinead Quinn, and I work in the Rural Strategy and Social Enterprise Unit in the Department of Rural and Community Development. We're delighted to launch this report today. It has been a while in the making, arising from a commitment in our rural future to research the experiences and outcomes of young people in rural Ireland. Ensuring the research applied a rural lens, looking at the perspective of young people living, studying, socialising in rural Ireland was of significance. Young people are a really important cohort of society, and particularly for rural Ireland, because they are the future of small towns and villages across the country. And we need to create places that young people want to live in and return to raise their families, and to help sustain the future of our towns and villages. Also rising from our rural future, and as a direct result of consultation with young people in developing the policy, we established a Rural Youth Assembly, and I know the Minister referenced this earlier. And we chose the theme of civic participation of young people in rural Ireland for the 2023 event in October. And it was really interesting to get the response of young people to the research and their recommendations on how we can address the policy implications. And there was a wide-ranging discussion, and I have to commend the young people in distilling it to just 9 recommendations out of a day's work, which were across political engagement, volunteering, and community engagement. And I think it was coming through clearly that young people want to get involved in their local communities, in volunteering, and have their say about local and national policies that affect them. And I just want to mention a few key themes from their discussions, which is important, I think, for us to hear. The importance of awareness and education around the opportunities to participate and how to get involved was highlighted. Ensuring young people feel included, ensuring those with disabilities can access facilities, and also ensuring a warm and welcoming environment for young people that will encourage them to participate. Obviously, the challenges around access and transport arose, and we got the unique perspective of young people from our islands who face particular challenges relating to many things, including attending second level education, participating in sporting activities, and socialising. So, as I said, there were 9 recommendations arising from those discussions, and we will be sharing them with our government colleagues. And we hope that this will result in the inclusion of some new actions in our Rural Future annual work plans that will respond to the recommendations made. So just looking at the research itself, there were a couple of key messages that resonated with me as a policymaker. Firstly, and to put it simply, we have to involve young people in our consultations to develop policy. We cannot presume to know the wants or the needs of young people and the challenges particular to them without asking them. And a question was posed by one young person at the assembly, and that was, can I make a difference? And we need to show through consultation and collaboration with young people that their voice is important, it is being heard, and importantly, we need to feed back to the young people how their input is considered. The Rural Youth Assembly is a great example of how we can do this and the value it can bring to government policy formation. And as a department, DRCD is looking at other ways it can consult with young people. The PPN structures, many of you will be familiar with, were recently reviewed. And one recommendation was to engage more with organisations such as Corlin and Og, so that we can ensure young people's contribution and influence on local government policy making. We're also seeking the involvement of young people across a number of our programmes, such as the input of young people to the local action groups for the New Leader programme and to the town teams established under the Town and Village Renewal Scheme. And this is also very relevant to another policy implication from the research. Young people need spaces and facilities locally so that they can participate in volunteering opportunities and in their wider community. So involving them in local action groups and town teams can ensure their views on the need for local facilities and the development of appropriate social spaces to meet and socialise can be factored into those local area plans. The department also funds many community development projects across the country, and there is huge scope to involve young people. But this does require commitment from all stakeholders, government departments, local authorities, local development companies, and youth organisations to work together to ensure that young people are included and heard. I just want to briefly mention also the National Volunteering Strategy, which my department has responsibility for. And there are measures included in that which relate to increasing the number and diversity of young people volunteering. And we will work with Department of Children and all stakeholders to action those measures. And that will include the development of a dedicated youth engagement strategy and developing a toolkit for volunteer centres and volunteer involving organisations on how to develop a volunteer programme for young people. And finally and lastly, I just want to say that we were delighted to collaborate with DCE on this research and are grateful for the expertise of the ESRI. So my thanks to Gráinne Collins in DCE lead researcher James Laurence and Dr Emer Smith for their cooperation and work and expertise in preparing this report. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sinead. I presume you can stay with us on the panel, and we might come back to you during the discussion where we'll tease out some of the issues a little bit further. So our next contributor then is Bairbre Meaney from the Department of Children. And again, Bairbre, thanks so much for coming along today, and we look forward to your comments.
Thanks very much, Alan. And thank you for that really fascinating presentation, James. The research is very meaningful, I think. As Alan said, my name is Bairbre Meaney. I'm the principal in the Participation, Play and Recreation Unit in the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. DCD has always had a participation unit dedicated to ensuring that children and young people have a say when government is making policy. This is in line with Article 12 of the UNCRC, which states that every child has a right to express their views, feelings and wishes in all matters affecting them, and to have their views considered and taken seriously. The Participation Unit, my unit, leads on the implementation of Article 12 and works to ensure the voice of children and young people are included when decisions that will impact their lives and the environment they live in are being made. I think the link established in this research between volunteering and positive life outcomes means that it's important for many units in the CD and for other departments. Within our department, Youth Affairs will be interested in the relationship established between the presence of local youth facilities and volunteering. Parenting Support Unit will be interested in the impact that engagement on public issues in the home can have on a young person's likelihood to volunteer and their civic engagement. And of course, the Integration and Equality Unit will be interested in terms of the differences in volunteering between different genders and young people living in different locations. The analysis also has implications for policy areas across other departments, the relationship between attendance and enjoyment of school and volunteering, the effective transition year, the importance of young people's extracurricular activity for non-sport related volunteering will also be of interest, I think, to the Department of Education. Department of Health may find the positive impacts of volunteering on a young person's mental health, regardless of where they are living, of interest. There are also interesting findings for Department of Rural and Community Affairs on volunteering patterns among young people living in rural areas compared with their urban counterparts. Department of Transport in relation to transport issues that have been surfaced, especially for young people in rural areas, and for tourism, culture, arts, sport and media on the sports organisations and volunteering, especially among boys and young men. From my perspective, this research also shines light on an area emerged during the last couple of years at an international level, that of increasing disengagement of young people in society, which is creating worrying trends for political participation and for society in general. This year alone, we've had several delegations and contacts from other jurisdictions, including Taiwan, Japan, Iceland and New Zealand, wishing to find out about how our participation structures work, how they operate, and how they could be used to address the trend towards the disengagement of their own youth from civic society. Nations have told us of their government's concerns about the future of their societies as their young people become more involved with the online world and less involved with each other and with society in general. This has been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and enforced lockdowns, for which we all know young people have been disproportionately impacted. So a number of people have already alluded to our Irish participation structures, and I'll just mention them very briefly. We have said overall responsibility for ensuring that children and young people have a say. The permanent participation structures we support include Corla and Oak, which Sinead just mentioned and the Minister also alluded to. They're child and youth councils for people aged 12 to 17 years. They operate in the 31 local authority areas. We have 1,000 plus young people around the country involved in Corla, and it's the recognised national structure for consulting children and young people. We have Dún or the Youth Parliament, which is a biannual national youth parliament for young people in that 12 to 17 age group. It attracts 200 delegates elected by their local Corley. Each Corla also elects representatives to the Corla National Executive to take action at the national level on young people's vote at Dún. Sinead was held for the first time last year, actually on the 10th of November, to mark the centenary of the Senate. It provides another national level forum where young people can bring their concerns into the public arena for debate. The National Youth Assembly, which has also been referenced here today, was established in 2022 by our department, and it's an overarching structure to allow young people to consider and debate issues of national importance and to feed their views into government policy. The age span there is 12 to 25 years. It includes delegates from Corla and also delegates from relevant youth organisations. The Assembly makes recommendations to government, as Sinead said, from the National Rural Youth Assembly and also from the National Youth Assembly on Climate on an annual basis. And there's also capacity for up to 2 more youth assemblies to be convened on issues if required. We don't have the kind of data that will allow us to track the impacts of this type of participation on young people's eventual civic and political engagement. As was noted in the presentation, there's very little systematic research in Ireland in this area, but today's research, I think, shows us the possibilities. I'll stop here to allow an actual delegate from the National Youth Assembly to share his knowledge of this type of direct participation.
Great. Thanks so much, Barbara. And you've set up our next contributor very, very well, I have to say. So we've had a couple of mentions already of the Rural Youth Assembly. So it is great that we have one of the participants from the Assembly with us. That's Jack Fagan. And again, lots of remarks already about the importance in this area of hearing from the people who are directly affected by the sort of things we're talking about. So Jack, we're delighted to have you here today. You're very welcome to the event. And before you speak, I'm just going to remind people that they can submit questions. I think I said the chat function earlier on, but I think the Q&A function seems to be working if people want to submit questions. So again, after Jack's remarks, we'll come to the Q&A. So with that, over to you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jack. I'm the delegate of the National Youth Assembly of Ireland. I'm extremely grateful if you have me today to listen to my opinions on this topic. The National Youth Assembly was established by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth to act as a consultative youth forum on topics of national interest. It provides young people with an opportunity to make recommendations directly to the government to inform public policy. The National Rural Youth Assembly is an annual assembly run in partnership with the Department of Rural and Community Development. This year's topic was the civic participation of young people in rural Ireland. 60 young people attended, aged 12 to 24 years, from across Ireland and the islands last month to discuss some recommendations and make recommendations on this topic. We were delighted to have Emer from the ESRI to present our preparation session ahead of the Assembly. I myself am in transition year, and I think by far it's the best decision I've made in my time in school. It gives me more opportunities to get involved in my community and volunteer for different events such as this. I was introduced into civic engagement at the age of 10. I started by making speeches on behalf of young people in my local community after joining the Child Young Person Services Committee, shortened to CYPSI Youth Forum, supported by my local family resource centre, Luscagranny Granard. I would attend events for on behalf of the Longford Westmeath SIPSI. I attended many of these events and continue to do so on behalf of Luston Grania Family Resource Centre. I was then introduced to Feroga at the age of 13, although it was quite hard as it was through COVID-19 pandemic. So all the meetings were held online and very little volunteering was done. As soon as the restrictions were lifted, we were back in full swing. I was interested to see that one of the policy implications from this research was educational opportunities for civic engagement, particularly in transition year has positive impacts on young people and their communities. One of the recommendations from the National Rural Youth Assembly this year ties with that. We recommended that the Department of Education should include volunteering to be made part of the school curriculum at both junior and senior cycle. My experience so far in transition year has been a positive one in regards to civic engagement, but not all schools might be the same. I've been involved in different types of youth civic engagement, such as fundraisers for the Red Cross following the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and our group were rewarded the Garda Youth Award for this. My involvement in my community led me to get involved in the Feroga Leadership for Life programme to increase my skills. I have learned a lot through this programme, made lifelong friends, and gained a huge interest in learning to advocate for young people. I try to be a good example by volunteering and speaking on behalf of the youth of my community and Ireland. I think it is extremely important for young people to get involved in civic engagement for many different reasons, such as it helps gain confidence, gives you a sense of accomplishment, and a sense of pride in your community. And above all, it's setting a good example for others to get involved. Not only can volunteering help with your life skills, but I find it helps my mental health. For example, when we done the fundraiser aiding Ukraine, I felt I was helping other teenagers who were having a tougher time than I was. That really opened my eyes to how much volunteering helps young people mature and grow. I think transition year is a great way for young people to get involved in volunteering. As I said earlier, transition year was the best decision I've made so far, as I was able to focus more on volunteering any way I can. It also so far has helped me build my confidence, presenting skills and teamwork skills, more doing things such as organising events in school, organising trips, presenting projects, and working with groups, and much more.
Great, thank you so much, Jack. Appreciate the comments. So we're going to move on 15 minutes or so for some Q&A. So I'm going to invite actually both the authors and the panelists maybe to turn on their cameras again if they would. So this feels more like a panel, and then I should welcome my colleague Emer Smith to enter the screen as well. So listen, there's a number of questions coming in, and I'm going to do my best to sort of relay them. And questions, Amy Stapleton and Maura Layden from the ASTI have asked questions which sort of fall under the general issues of migrant status and ethnic status, and then more generally marginalized youth. So I guess it's really a question for James and Emer. Did the study sort of go into that level of granular detail on those specific areas, or anyway, is that something for another day? So James or Emer?
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and thank you for the questions. So we did actually look at the role of migrant status in the study, and that's whether somebody, if a young person had two migrant parents. I think one of the issues with looking at the 1998 cohort, though Emer can always correct me, is that it has a smaller proportion of migrant parents in it. So we couldn't actually dig down too deeply into nationality differences, for example, or even ethnic differences so much. But we actually found, and this is in the report, that children with two migrant parents, there generally wasn't a huge amount of difference in terms of their volunteering. There was some evidence that they may be slightly less involved in sports volunteering. But I think what came out was that in terms of political engagement, young people with two migrant parents did tend to be less involved in political activities, also less registered to vote, as one might expect, and also have a lower interest in politics too. So there was definitely an area there where the children of migrants may potentially have less political knowledge because their parents don't have the same level of political knowledge, or also simply perhaps the parents themselves are not registered to vote, for example, and then that might not end up in the kind of socialization of young people into more political attitudes.
Okay, and I mean, I'm just going to supplement the question a little bit, and again, get your reaction. But when I saw some of the findings in regard to socioeconomic status, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to be lower levels of volunteering. But was that essentially just like yet another dimension of social inclusion and social exclusion? Okay, that so often when we're doing these sort of webinars, similar themes come up. But when you just wonder about the finding on socioeconomics and engagement, is it just a sort of, I don't know, be it a fatalism? Because I think, James, again, you mentioned in terms of political engagement, the feeling for some people that, well, it doesn't really make any difference. So are we picking up something about people who feel disengaged or something like that from their communities and their societies, or am I over-interpreting? So again, James and Emer.
Yeah, oh, please go ahead, Ema.
No, sorry to interrupt. No, I mean, it was concerning that we see a clear social gradient. We see it in volunteering, which is of particular concern given the benefits for young people themselves and the protective role it has in less integrated neighbourhoods. But it is really concerning that we're seeing a clear social gradient in political interest, political activities, even being registered to vote. So there is a risk there for us as a democracy that we have a group of young people who feel that they don't have kind of a basis for involvement in the politics of the society, that they do feel a bit more excluded. At the same time, on the positive level, we do see the kind of level of activity there was there around the constitutional referendum campaign, and that there is a potential there to really involve young people when they see the issue as of concern to them. But the challenge is to get them to kind of feel that day-to-day politics are of concern to them too.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Jack, do you have a perspective on that? I mean, I know you were talking positively about your own engagement, but when you look at your peers, can you look at the group of people who are not engaging and give us sort of some insights into to why people don't? Is it just lack of interest, or a sense that they can't have an impact?
Yeah, no, it's not a thing that's a lack of interest. I just don't think young people think it's kind of they can't help, and they don't try to help. They don't try to make the difference. Whereas if there's more like more help given, more like a step up, you know what I mean? I think they need the little push to just get started. Like,
yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. Let me move on to another question then. This is from our ESRI colleague Fran McGinnity, and I'll read it out. So as Fran said, it was interesting to see that in spite of all the challenges, especially transport and facilities, young people in rural areas are actually more likely to be involved in volunteering overall. So so as we saw from the results, more likely to be involved in sports volunteering, but then similar levels of non-sports volunteering. So I don't know, again, James or Emer, if you want to speculate, I mean, any idea on why that is the case, why there seems to be this rural advantage here, or at least sort of, positive result, as Fran says, in spite of difficulties such as transport?
Yeah, so I think that, well, it's an excellent question, and it's one that we are trying to grapple with ourselves, really, I suppose. This kind of this rural advantage to volunteering, even in the face of those kinds of obstacles, it leaves the big question of that we weren't able to, I suppose, get to in this study, which is what is going on the ground in these areas. So what is happening in rural communities? Where is the volunteering taking place? So one of the suggestions that came up was potentially the role of the GAA in this, and that might kind of involve a lot more young people, perhaps through schools and the like. And so schools and their link with their sports volunteering may be playing a bigger role. Emer might be able to shed a bit more light on it, but I do think that's one of the areas that came out that really kind of demands more research and more finer grained detail data, I think.
Yeah, if I could come in there, another feature was that there seemed to be more differences by things like education performance in urban areas than in rural areas. So it seems to be that in rural areas where there are facilities and there are opportunities, that the whole community becomes involved. Whereas in urban areas, I think social groups can live in different social worlds. So that means that you have more of a gap there between the advantage and the disadvantage in their involvement.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Actually, we may come back to that. Conscious there's a number of other questions, and I want to make sure we touch on as many of them as possible. Another question from Edward Crean here about whether or not young people with disabilities were again looked at as a separate group. Again, James, Emer, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Emer, if you. So we did look at young people with disabilities, and unfortunately we weren't able to dig too deeply into understanding different patterns of participation amongst them. But I think, as came out of the presentation, they do tend to be less involved in sports volunteering later in life. But there is no difference in terms of engagement in non-sports volunteering. But interestingly, when it comes to political engagement, they tended to be more involved in political activities, and I think had somewhat higher political interest as well. So whether it's related to access and ability to an opportunity to engage in different forms of participation, there's definitely a kind of a high level of involvement there.
Okay, okay, it's a question from an anonymous attendee, and Sinead, can I put you on notice? I might run this one by you, and always conscious when civil servants are on these, so we don't expect you to go beyond your brief or anything like that, but if you have an observation, it would be good. So the first thing the anonymous attendee says is that the research is brilliant with an exclamation mark, so we'll obviously take that. But then the point goes on, Republic of Ireland, where like many fine examples, where government is doing well in this area. And again, the question is clear that there are several platforms for young people, to engage. But I think one of the issues that always comes up in this area, Sinead, and you'll be very, very familiar with this, it's the extent that for community groups, drawing down funding in these areas is often very, very complex. Okay, now, quite correctly, there can be demanding application processes and reporting processes, and you'll be familiar with this, that a lot of sort of community groups say they spend a huge amount of time and energy dealing with the administration and the bureaucracy. And I think when you see the sort of results that are coming out here from James and Emer, that you see there's such sort of great interest and willingness to engage and everything like that. And on your side, the department is doing so much to try and foster all that. But sometimes there's a perception that there's this bureaucratic administrative impediment or whatever. So do you want to just sort of reflect on that sort of for a moment? And maybe sort of talk about what the department is trying to do to make sure that the funding does arrive as quickly and as sort of productively as possible where you're trying to aim it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, I can absolutely appreciate the at times frustration of community groups in applying for funding. It is quite complex, and we are trying to identify and pull together the information across government as to where the funding streams are. And we are looking at making the application process a little bit more streamlined. There is a certain amount of bureaucracy and levels that we have to hit in terms of applications. We have held information events in the past in terms of informing community groups what funding is available and giving them assistance in their application. And a lot of community groups would work with their local development companies, who are a great support in this area and in completing applications. So it's not an easy fix. I, as I said, can understand the difficulty that organisations have and community groups have, it is something that we are aware of and that we are making attempts to address and ensure that we work closely with. A lot of our funding goes through the LCDCs and the local authorities, and making sure that we, give notice ahead of what funding streams are coming on board and when they're going to be launched and so on, so that people are aware of what's coming up and they are ready to apply for those various streams. But it's something that we have to continue to try and improve, and provide information upfront to people that will make the process a little bit easier.
Yeah, no, thanks. It is a really difficult issue, I know, because obviously when you're distributing public funds, you need to have a certain amount of bureaucracy, but it's just striking that balance. There's another set of questions here about the link between transition year and volunteering, and just how this link seems to be positive. And Barbara, could I put it just a very, very quick question to you? Minister O'Brien kind of touched on this already, which was this idea that there are findings in this report which go beyond the two main departments. So how does it work in terms of making sure the Department of Education know about this? And at your sort of level within the civil service, how did the discussions proceed so that you can sort of give policy advice? Again, it's a sort of a public administration question as much as anything else. But I'd be just sort of curious to hear how that works.
Yeah, there are structures where we would share information and share. I'd imagine there should be people from the Department of Education on this, maybe would have been invited because of the content of the research. I mean, I don't know, I can't see participants. But certainly from my perspective, this is something I would be sharing with my colleagues in Department of Education in their new participation unit. And it might be that kind of bilateral engagement, especially in a type of, in this type of research piece. It's for information, it's going to inform development of policy. And it's on my radar, it's on other people's radar. So it's the kind of thing that will be referred back to. And of course, it's in our research unit now. So but dissemination is a problem, and getting, if you're not directly involved with it, it is an issue to kind of feed it in. But as I was trying to intimate in my piece, I do think there are lots of really good findings here that should be shared and will be shared with all the other departments.
Yeah, no, it's good. I think it has surprised I think ESRI people from time to time over the years that we do live remarkably segmented professional lives, and very often when there are things that are relevant. Sinead, you wanted to come in?
Thanks, Alan. I'm not sure, am I on mute there? You can hear me now.
No, we can hear you. Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. Obviously, again, I'm not sure if there are colleagues here from my own department, but I'll certainly be sharing it with units across the divisions. And I mentioned in my input, I mentioned the importance of the local action groups and the town teams, and we will be drawing attention to our colleagues on the findings of the report. But I just want to mention there is a process for under our Rural Future policy that is a whole of government approach, and our department has huge engagement with all departments on the various actions, and there is a process there of annual review, and there's reports published on our website, and also there's an annual process to develop work plans for the year ahead. So there will be bilateral meetings, bilateral engagement with departments coming towards the end of this year. So that will also give us an opportunity to share the research and the recommendations of the RYA. I mentioned those earlier. We will be feeding those into the bilateral discussions with departments, and we will be, requesting departments to take on board and consider what actions they may include in their work plans for 2024 to respond to the policy implications and the RYA recommendations.
Very good. Thanks so much for that. Just staying with transition year, and again, I might direct this in the first instance to Emer, but Sarah Keaveney asked the question, do the panelists think that a more structured approach to political/democratic education in TY could have a positive impact on civic and political engagement in both urban and rural areas? So I guess if I could just sort of broaden the question ever so slightly, Emer, this is one of these occasions in which something like TY is being observed as a positive, but then people want to hang more things on it, and I guess there's always this risk that, and Jack, you might have a perspective on this too, that TY works because there's a great degree of flexibility to offer young people to exposure to various sort of things. So when I see a proposal that, something is locked in, it worries me ever so slightly, because it means that you could be locking something out. But you know much more about this than I do, Emer, so I'd be interested on your thoughts.
I mean, I think what's striking is that transition year is already very successful in promoting volunteering and in promoting political awareness and engagement. And I think the challenge is to try and provide those opportunities in the rest of senior cycle. Not everyone takes transition year, as James pointed out. Everyone takes civic, social and political education at junior cycle, but there's no equivalent at senior cycle. So there's a real gap there. There's a new politics and society course, but it's optional and it's a minority of young people. We've seen from other research that young people feel the main gaps in their education around preparation for the world of work, but also for adult life more generally. So I think there is a case to have not at all in TY. I think that's doing very well already, but in the rest of senior cycle, and that would be particularly important, I think, for the more disadvantaged groups that we've seen, also for the political socialization of migrant origin youth as well, that would really allow young people to be prepared for their world, for their active part in a democracy.
Yeah, and interesting. Do you have a perspective, Jack? Do you think transition year should be done any differently, or would you agree with Emer's point that maybe rolling these sort of things into the latter part of senior cycle is the important point?
No, I agree with Emer 100%. I think transition year as it is now is working perfectly. It's working grand, and if people don't do it, it's their own life. Like, it shouldn't matter if they do or do not do it. But I do think there needs to be more political education, if you know what I mean, like the CSPE needs to be rolled on through to the senior cycle, even not as an exam subject, just to have your knowledge on it, just more education about politics and civil engagement.
Very good. We'll just take another couple. Conscious we said we'd finish by 12:30, so eager to make sure that we stay on time. Paul Gordon from the National Youth Council of Ireland has a question, and again, Sinead, this might be one for you. You've kind of touched on some of this already. Paul's question is, what are the next steps in terms of progressing policy implications or recommendations for the departments, particularly in respect of the importance of provision of local youth facilities? So next step, I guess it's a question about the policy formation process.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I said there, that obviously we have to disseminate the research findings and point to the policy implications, and I will be doing that among my own colleagues across the division, and it will be applicable to those funding programs that will fund and invest in the local facilities. So again, looking at getting young people or youth organisations involved in and being consulted through the local action group, the town teams, the development of local economic development plans. There's a link there with the local authorities as well, and the LCDC committees within the local authorities. So there's opportunity there to ensure that there's a solid identification of the needs of the local area, where there are gaps that they're identified, and then to ascertain how where the funding will be assigned to address those gaps in facilities. But it's certainly, as I said, the biggest issue here is about consultation, ensuring the needs are identified, and thereafter, solid decisions can be made as to where the funding investment should go.
Very good. And we're probably approaching the last question. I was eager to get this one in. I won't explain why, I'll just deal with the question. So it's from Mark Clegg. Do you find that volunteering in local communities is more reactive to certain situations, for example, COVID-19? Okay. And then the other part of the question, also, did you find that some volunteers felt burnt out due to expectations within their communities? And I think it's an interesting question in the context when you talk about volunteering. Talk to any community group, and they'll sort of say that one of the problems in volunteering in Ireland, it's very often that the same group of people do all the volunteering, whereby the sort of the pressures and the expectations on them are absolutely huge. And it almost sort of reminds you of that work situation, you know what I mean? That if you put your hand up too often, the tasks keep raining down on you. So I don't know, James and Emer, anything in the study about the sort of, the time intensity on certain people, and as to whether or not can volunteering almost become then a burden beyond a certain point. Okay, one of you going to have to be brave.
I'll stick my head out. I think it's a situation where we don't have the data in the report to investigate this. It wasn't in there, but I suppose something we did find interesting was that we were wondering if, for example, people had a finite amount of time to distribute between different things. So if they were working, for example, were they less able to give time over to volunteering? And we didn't actually find that was the case. So we found that people who were volunteering, people who were engaged in part-time work, for example, were also more likely to be volunteering as well. So there didn't appear to be this trade-off. And I think it kind of speaks to this, I think, as you said earlier, this wider sense of kind of engagement and inclusion in life. I think when people are out either still in education or working, it provides, I suppose, opportunities to volunteer, to engage more. People are in many ways simply kind of invited to do it. And so I think that could end up with people taking on too much, but I do think that the more people tend to get engaged, the more these opportunities open up for them as well, both kind of in work life, in education life, and in the kind of civic life as well.
No, very good. Look, time is drawing to a close. Emer, can I just ask you very quickly, and this is a different type of question. When James just mentioned there, sort of volunteering and finite time, our report on carers amongst young people, that's a forthcoming report, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So just to flag again, Barbara's Department of Children, right, so commissioned this for, again, using GUI data, which is around care responsibilities and time inputs amongst younger people. And I mention it here just because James kind of put it into my head, that notion of time demands on people. And in a sense, then that's a sort of a parallel study. So Barbara, I'm not sure if you're aware of that or not coming down the line, but we'll be talking about that hopefully. Will that be before Christmas, Emer, for a launch?
It'll be after Christmas at this stage. We don't have an exact date yet.
Very good. But anyway, that'll be another important and interesting report. I see a comment, Sarah Keaveney. Fantastic, thanks, amazing research. That's probably as good a way to conclude as any other. So again, let me just thank, although I know he's gone off the call, Minister O'Brien, for joining us. I want to thank Sinead, Barbara and Jack for participating, not only giving your remarks, but participating actively in the discussion. Congratulations again to James and Emer for a fantastic report. And finally, want to thank all the participants on the webinar this morning. Great that so many people stayed with us and contributed questions as well. So with that, I think we'll close the event and just hope everybody has a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.